opportunity a reality. What Reagan was suggesting, as hard as it is to believe now, in retrospect, knowing what we know about him ideologically, was that it was not enough to simply pass civil rights laws as we had done in the 1960s, imploring folks to treat everyone equally and to refrain from discrimination. He was suggesting that long entrenched patterns of discrimination against peoples of color and preferences and privileges and head starts for those of us who were white had created such an uneven playing field in this nation that conscious efforts, deliberate efforts at inclusion had to be made. And Reagan was right in 1974. And again, it pains me to say the words Reagan was right. But it was true. And the logic of that day still holds, as I'll demonstrate in just a few seconds. Affirmative action is ultimately good for America because it is one of the, again, not the only one, and probably not the most important one, but one of the principal mechanisms for balancing out and ultimately nullifying institutionalized white racial preference and privilege in the American job market, the educational system, and contracting. In other words, affirmative action is an important mechanism for obtaining or coming closer to a true equal opportunity society, not merely in word, but in deed. In its absence, white racial preference and privilege will remain untouched and entrenched and would in fact be strengthened. The choice, and this is important, the choice in this country is not, as Ward Connerly may have you believe, between a society where there is affirmative action preference for people of color on the one hand, or on the other hand, a society where all are treated equally. That is not the choice. It is a choice between a society where racial preferences for whites remain in place, unchallenged and unmoderated by the countervailing force of affirmative action for people of color on the one hand, or a society where those white racial preferences, systemic and institutionalized as they are and have always been, will in fact be balanced and challenged by those efforts. In other words, to end affirmative action is not to end racial preference. It will only end the programs that seek to minimize such preferences as they operate each and every day in the lives of whites in this country, myself very much included. Because you see, however much Mr. Connerly may not wish to acknowledge it, and however much America on the whole may not wish to acknowledge it, the history of this country is the history of racial preference for my people, beginning at least as early as, if not before, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which you should know but probably don't because no one ever taught you this before in all likelihood, was the very first law that the Congress of the United States passed after the ratification of the Constitution. Before they did anything else, the first order of business was to pass a Naturalization Act which said that all free white folk and only free white folk could be citizens of the United States, an act of affirmative action and racial preference, though we strangely never call it that. Fast forward 70 years or so to the 1860s and the passage of the Homestead Act, which allowed whites and virtually only whites to claim 270 million acres of land, most of it west of the Mississippi, 160 acres a family for $10 down, but black and brown folk couldn't get it, and of course it was brown folk land got jacked in the first place. 270 million acres, and there are 70 million white folk today as I speak living on that land that their families would never have had but for an act of white racial preference. But we don't talk about it like that, and we don't talk about the FHA and the VA loan programs for housing begun in the 1930s as being white racial preference. But now for the first 30 years of those programs, the only folks getting in on that government subsidized, government guaranteed, government provided housing, which in fact was the linchpin of the building of the white middle class in this country, were white folks. People of color could not get in on it. For the first 30 years, those benefits were almost exclusively for whites, $120 billion in housing equity loaned preferentially to white families, 35 million of them. And yet I tell you, my family got everything based on hard work. Nobody ever gave us anything because of the color of our skin. Yeah, nothing except that house, and nothing except that land, and nothing except that job you got with the GI Bill, which was supposed to be for all GIs, but it didn't really go down like that in practice. Those are all policies that if we believed in honest language in this country, but we do not, we would call affirmative action and racial preference. And if it was benefiting black folk, we'd have called it welfare. But because it benefited white people, we call it good macroeconomic policy. And we just leave well enough alone, you see. And as a result of those and other policies, the average white family in this country, I don't mean the average wealthy white family, I mean the average white family in the United States has 11 times the net worth of the average African American family, 8 times the average net worth of the typical Latino family. Got nothing to do with harder work, better values, better culture, better DNA, or any of that. It has to do with systematic preference, and none of that is going to go away if you abolish affirmative action. If anything, it will become worse. Now, perhaps you believe that all that's in the past, and we should focus on the present. Fine. Aside from how utterly convenient it is to shrug off the effects of past injustice on the modern day racial realities, the fact is that that systematized white racial preference continues today. And this is a very important point, because even Ward Connerly is on record as saying, so long as discrimination was rampant, affirmative action was indeed needed. August 10th, 1994, the man I am debating this evening testifies to the Judiciary Committee of the California State Assembly, and he says, quote, "There was a time when affirmative action had value. There was discrimination and we needed some sort of shock treatment. The time has come to take off the training wheels," end of quote. Now understand what this means and why I have quoted him this evening. It means that Mr. Connerly cannot claim this evening to oppose race-conscious efforts like affirmative action on principle, because he is on record as admitting that as long as racial discrimination is rampant against folks of color, the programs are needed, which means, my friends, the only issue before us tonight, the only one, is whether systemic discrimination still indeed exists against folks of color. If it does, and don't you just know I'm about to prove it, then his own words suggest that the debate is over and affirmative action is both necessary and good. So what is the truth today? Not 30 years ago, not 50 years ago, but right about now. Well, for one, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, that's the agency charged with monitoring compliance with affirmative action and civil rights law more broadly, has reported that upwards of 75% of all companies covered by equal opportunity requirements, not just affirmative action now, but even the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that 3 out of 4 of those companies covered by the law are in substantial violation of the law because of ongoing patterns of discrimination, not against white people, but against folks of color. The problem is that our government does not prioritize civil rights enforcement and never has done so, be it run by Democrats or Republicans. And so the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs only has about 4,000 monitors on their payroll whose job it is to check up and see if folks are following the law. That is so few that it's only enough to check up on each company once every 46 years and determine whether or not they're in compliance. There's literally no deterrent then to prevent that kind of discrimination. As such, discrimination against people of color continues unabated, whether we wish to see it or not. Moving on, 3 years ago, a study from MIT and the University of Chicago, both of their econ departments, found that job applicants with white-sounding names, 50% more likely to get a call back for a job interview for an actual job than folk with black-sounding names, even when all relevant qualifications, merit indicators are indistinguishable from one another. Important for 2 reasons. Number one, it suggests a pattern of ongoing discrimination against folk of color, and it disproves quite mightily this notion of reverse discrimination, because if indeed it was white folks that couldn't catch a break in the labor market, and if indeed it paid to be black, this study would have been the one to prove it. Man, you could just sort of put yourself in the place of the personnel director, and you come into the job on Monday and you open up your mail and you see the resume and you say, well, hot damn, Tamika has applied for the job. Oh, I must hire her. What'd you say, Jamal applied? Hell yes, get Jamal in here. But now, Mindy, no. Skylar, Jenny, I'm being sarcastic to make a point. This study demonstrated the pattern of discrimination is the same as it ever was. 1 year later, a study out of Milwaukee finds that white men with a criminal record slightly more likely to get a call back than black men without one, even when all the relevant qualifications, demeanor, dress, communication style, and everything related to merit are indistinguishable. Even worse, according to the National Center for Career Strategies, the vast majority, over 80% of all jobs in this country, are never openly advertised. Instead, they are filled by word of mouth through networks, and those tend to be largely race and gender exclusive in terms of who knows who lives around whom, who belongs to certain organizations and who does not, so that even if folk of color are the most qualified for something, there's a very good chance in this country that they will be scratched from the beginning of the race, so to speak, because they won't even know about the job availability because they are not in those networks. We know that this is one of the key reasons that 91% of all federal, state, and local contract dollars, even with affirmative action in place, still those dollars, 91 out of 100 of them received by white male-owned businesses, not because they are better, not because they do better work, not because they submit lower bids. Hell, white companies been jacking the government using low bids and then charging 5 times as much when the bill really comes due. Think Halliburton, think pretty much any company you want to think of for years, and they keep getting contracts. So it isn't about the bid, it isn't about competitiveness, it isn't about the quality of the work, it is about networks, knowing certain people, giving subcontracts to certain people, and those have a racial impact, even if it's not intended. Even if the contractors themselves are not overtly biased, you end up with a highly inequitable result. And none of this would end if affirmative action for people of color ended. If anything, it would become worse. We also have white racial preference in education, which won't be touched. But we heard a lot about the racial preferences for people of color at places like the University of Michigan because they gave 20 points to folks of color. We didn't talk about the fact that if you're from the Upper Peninsula, you got 16 points. I don't know if you've been there. The snow is not the only thing white in the Upper Peninsula of the state of Michigan, so when you give a preference on that basis, it ends up being racial. 4 points for the children of alumni, 92% of whom or more are white. If you went to one of the top schools in Michigan, you got 10 extra points, but who are the folks that went to those schools? Disproportionately white and affluent. If you had an AP curriculum throughout your junior and senior year, you got 8 extra points, which seems fair on face, but it's not, because the schools that serve mostly white students, not only in Michigan but around the country, have 3 times as many AP and honors courses offered per capita as the schools that serve students of color. All of that is what I mean when I say systematized white racial preference. Just because it isn't blatant, just because it doesn't call itself that, doesn't mean it's not that. It's like folks that get bent out of shape about Black History Month, because there isn't a White History Month, but of course there is. It just goes by the tricky name of May and June and July and August and September. Folks might say, well, that's all true, but you know, affirmative action lowers merit standards, and that's untrue as well. In the job market, we know, for example, that 200 studies have been done on this topic, and a meta-analysis, fancy language for a study of other people's studies, was published in the Journal of Economic Literature several years ago, publication of the American Economics Association, finding that those persons who have benefited from affirmative action perform equal to or better than their white male counterparts once they are given the opportunity to prove themselves. And in terms of education, we know that the SAT and the LSAT, the MCAT, the GRE are pathetically correlated with overall college performance. At most, they can explain 17% of the difference in the first year after you take the test. No correlation beyond that. In the state of California, where Mr. Connolly is from, there is no correlation at Berkeley or UCLA between your test score and your graduation rates above and beyond grades. And so really what we're talking about is reconceptualizing merit and realizing that at the end of the day, the standards we use are neither fair nor equitable, and that affirmative action is an important, though not a complete, tool for eradicating racial inequity and starting that discussion about what are the proper merit standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wise. I would just ask the audience to hold your applause until the end of the debate. Mr. Connolly will now deliver his opening negative response.
Good evening. I am delighted to be among you. When Mr. Wise comes out of his shell, he's going to be all right. I wish life were as simple as he makes it appear. Blacks on one side and whites on the other, people of color, as he says. And he conveniently glosses over the term affirmative action without ever really saying what he means by that. Throughout my involvement in this issue, it has not been to dismantle, quote, affirmative action. It has been to dismantle those policies that government practices which treat people differently on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order, 10925, that for the first time uttered the words affirmative action. And that executive order commanded all federal agencies and those doing business with the federal government to take, quote, affirmative action to ensure that no one would be discriminated against when doing business with the federal government on the basis of those prohibited factors of race, color, and the like. After his assassination, the Congress ratified what President Kennedy had put into place in his executive order in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that act guarantees you and I and everyone in this room the right to equal treatment, quote, without regard to race or color. Now, it's awfully seductive for someone to say that our society is racist at its core and that we have to use these tools, to use the common coin of the currency in this debate, to mitigate against that institutional racism. But as a nation, we're supposed to have certain ideals. We're supposed to practice those ideals. We have certain laws. We have a certain culture that prizes the concept of fairness. We're not always fair, but when we invoke that principle of fairness, generally, we can get people to do what is right based on that principle of fairness. One cannot argue logically the position that Mr. Wise takes. You cannot argue that people should be treated differently on the basis of race. Regardless of the construct that he makes, you cannot get from here to there by saying that there are different classes of American citizenship, and some of us are entitled to one form of treatment, and others are entitled to a different form of treatment. Some of you may not be familiar with Proposition 209 that passed in California by a margin of 55 to 45. Let me share the language with you. Quote, "The state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting." That's it. That's the language that Mr. Wise finds so objectionable. Nowhere in there are the words affirmative action mentioned. Not because we're trying to be cute about it or to deceive anybody, because we think that words matter. Affirmative action means different things to different people. What I'm opposed to is that form of affirmative action that treats people differently. Different standards, extra points, whatever involves treating people differently by a government agency, I'm opposed to. Now, I'm in support of affirmative action if it means socioeconomic conditions. I supported as a UC Regent comprehensive review, which was selecting those students who went to schools that did not have the honors courses, for example, or schools that had a history of underperformance. I support that form of affirmative action because I found that the University of California never sent outreach people to those schools. They did not have honors courses. Therefore, they could not get the 4.2 and the 4.4 to make them competitive for admission to Berkeley or UCLA or UC Santa Barbara or UC San Diego. I supported affirmative action when it meant giving a break of sorts to a student who had never had a parent go to college. I oppose unalterably treating people differently on the basis of those prohibited factors of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, public education, public contracting. If we're going to have a system in which we do have this two-tiered citizenship, as Mr. Wise would have you want, one for whites and one for people of color, how long? How long do we do that? How do we expect to have a civilized society without people being at each other's throats in that kind of a society? What is it saying about people like me for Mr. Wise to patronizingly suggest that we cannot compete? How long are we to be consigned to this presumption of our inadequacy? Anyone who presumes my inadequacy is not a friend of mine, no matter how great it might sound. You're not my friend. You're not my kid's friend. If you give them candy as the dentist, I want you to give the tough love. I want you to say it's a tough world. And you cannot compete in that world unless you go to high school, you graduate, you apply yourself, and then you're treated equally by every level of government. If there is discrimination, we all have a duty, I think, to ferret it out, to do what we can to get rid of it. But we don't say, we're going to give wholesale affirmative action, meaning different standards to people on the basis of race. Those who favor that, you have a duty to tell people how long you want to do that. Because I think that the patience of the American people is coming to an end with this form of affirmative action. Yesterday, the Supreme Court took up two cases which involve the use of race in student placement in K through 12. Next spring, I submit to you, with every belief that I can muster, that the court is going to strike it down. With that, we will begin to see the end of an era, the end of government being able to use race to move people around on the matrix of life based on this, I would say, perverse theory of those like Mr. Wise. We're going to have to find other ways to help those who need help, find other ways to provide access to those who are locked out. I want to do it on the basis of socioeconomic conditions, not on the basis of race or skin color. I believe that there is more within the body politic to support that than there is on the basis of race. Less than a month ago, the people of Michigan, a blue state, a Democrat governor, Democrat U.S. senators, voted 58 to 42 to end preferential treatment on the basis of those prohibited factors. I think that's a harbinger of things to come, folks. It's saying that the American people have lost their patience with the use of race as a way of solving social problems. And for those of us who want to solve social problems, it is incumbent upon us to find acceptable means, acceptable to the American people, for solving those problems. I think that there is a consensus around the use of socioeconomic factors. I urge that the University of Michigan get rid of legacy admits, as we did at the University of California. I didn't hear Mr. Wise weigh in on that. I've supported the comprehensive review. There's silence on the other end of the table for that approach. Why? Why do we support an outmoded concept that never really did enjoy major support among American people? Why can't we find a consensus among us for those things that people will embrace? They want to help those who need the help. It is not the same as saying they want to help black people because they presume that we all need the help. We all don't. So I think it's time for us to fashion solutions that are based on the right thing, the law, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and those things that people find to be fair. Thank you.
Mr. Wise has 5 minutes.
Well, let me just suggest that if we wait around for what's acceptable to the American people, which I guess, given who the majority of the American people are, means what's acceptable to white folk, we would never have had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because the majority of white folks didn't support it. In fact, at the time it was passed, 2/3 of white Americans said that Dr. King and the movement were asking for too much, too fast. See, white folk will tell you now they marched with Dr. King, but not so much. 2/3 of white folks in 1964 said the Civil Rights Act should be enforced voluntarily and we should just trust employers to do the right thing. So pardon me if I'm not prepared to wait around for what the majority thinks is a really good idea. Because the majority thought segregation was a great idea. The majority thought that slavery was a fine idea, that killing indigenous folks was fine, stealing half of Mexico was fine. The majority's always been pretty cool with that, so I'm not really concerned about what the majority thinks. Now, I've always found it interesting when Ward Connerly and others say that people like me are being patronizing to folk of color because we're implying they can't make it without affirmative action. He knows full well that's not what's being implied. He knows full well that the implication is simply that no matter how hard one works, no matter how talented one is, racism actually matters. Discrimination actually has an effect. Certainly we know that to be true. There were plenty of folks who worked real hard in the early part of the 1900s, but it was Madam C.J. Walker who became the first black millionaire in 1911. Didn't mean everybody could have done it, right? Because there were 62 black folk got lynched that year. So it wasn't a real good year for black people. But this one woman got rich. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have had the struggle for equity that folks were fighting at that time. I also find it interesting to have someone like Mr. Connerly say that it's patronizing and that it implies black people are somehow less capable, considering that he personally has received over the years nearly $1 million worth of funding from the Bradley Foundation. This is the same organization that paid Charles Murray $120,000 to write a little book you may have heard of called The Bell Curve, which actually says explicitly that black people are genetically inferior to white people. That's what the Bradley Foundation funded, and they've also given money to Mr. So here's a book that says black people are inferior, and he's sweating me because he thinks I'm implying it. A little bit of a contradiction. I would also suggest the argument's fundamentally racist, because since the vast majority of black and brown folks support affirmative action, to suggest that it insults their intelligence is to suggest that black people are too stupid to realize they're being insulted, which is a fundamentally racist argument. So it seems to me that argument has very little weight. He says we shouldn't have different standards for different people, and I fundamentally agree. You might be surprised, but I would suggest that without affirmative action, we have different and higher standards for people of color. Here's what I mean. If you have groups of people who, through no fault of their own, had started out in, let's say, an 8-leg relay race, if we just analogized American society to that, 3 laps behind other folks, and you still say, you got to have the same SAT score, we expect you to meet this exact same number in order to get in, or else you're not qualified. What you're actually saying is, you've got to run faster, you've got to be better, you've got to actually be smarter. So in fact, it is the opponents of affirmative action so-called preferences who would actually cement into place differential standards, asking the person who starts out 2 and 3 laps behind to hit the tape at the same time or earlier. I would suggest that if someone starts out 3 laps behind and finishes 1 lap behind and has closed the gap in terms of their performance, that's the faster runner. That's the one I want on my team, not the one who hit the tape first because he had a head start. I got news for you. If you've had more opportunity than me, you're supposed to have a better resume than me. If you've had more opportunity than me, you're supposed to get a better score than me. That's what comes with the advantage. That's what advantage is. But are we going to reward people on the basis of the head start over which they had no merit in terms of earning it? Are we going to punish folk who through no fault of their own started behind? Now, Ward Connerly makes a very good argument about socioeconomic affirmative action. It's not, by the way, one I disagree with. The only question is it an either-or proposition? It is certainly a good idea to have socioeconomic affirmative action, but let us remember that economic obstacles are not the only ones faced by people of color. There are people of color. I'll just take this city as an example. Middle class and above black folks with $50,000 a year or more in annual income. These are not poor folks. Just as likely to live in racially segregated high poverty communities as black folks with $2,500 a year in annual income, in part because of ongoing housing discrimination in this and other communities. So if all we do is look at the socioeconomics, we might say those families face no barriers, and that would be untrue. We need both economic and race-based affirmative action. Thank you.
If you want to fashion policies that solve social problems, you cannot be disdainful of the majority. It is foolish to be so. The majority is what dictates policy. The majority of the Congress that passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, those racists, were white. That was the majority that we had to rely upon. They can be prevailed upon to do the right thing. Black people, we're not the only ones who hold the franchise to being oppressed. We have to rely on the instinct to be fair of people. If we don't believe in that, then the whole democratic process fails. It crumbles. The Congress, I remind you, was white that passed the 64 Civil Rights Act. Yes, the Congress had to be urged by Dr. King and others to do what was the right thing. But Dr. King did rely on that judgment of people to be fair. And he said, you must live out the true meaning of your creed. The nation responded. And so I appeal to you to not embrace that notion that because they're white, they can't be fair, can't be trusted. And we're always going to be up against a majority that won't do the right thing. 42% of the people who voted in favor of keeping preferential treatment. And by the way, those were the words that Sandra Day O'Connor used, race preferences, when she cast her 5-4 vote in favor of the University of Michigan. So it's not just my term. The term race preferences has meaning to those who are involved in this issue. And the Congress decided to go with that policy of treating everyone equally without regard to race. And I renew my assertion that in order for us to be a society that remains true to what we believe in, we profess to believe in, we have to be true to that policy of treating everyone as an equal. I don't see how we as a society can survive with people expecting and getting different classes of citizenship. Statistics don't matter in this debate. Statistics don't matter. The whole idea of history 40 years ago or 100 years ago doesn't matter. Because the court has said, we're not here to cure societal ills. The only rationale for using race is the pursuit of diversity. And I submit to you that is on very, very tenuous grounds. And so, as we begin to look forward to what kind of a policy paradigm we're going to have with regard to this very contentious issue of affirmative action or race preferences, you have to rely on the majority, because in state after state, the people are striking down preferences. You have to trust the instincts of people to be fair, because people who are in the Congress, whether we like it or not, are largely white. And we have to believe that they're capable of doing the right thing for our system of government to survive. We have to find something other than race if we want to expand access to people who are now locked out of the system. And I submit socioeconomic conditions are the way to go. Thank you.
I don't know if you caught it, but something that Mr. Connerly said actually completely obliterates the fundamental premise of his entire argument. He says on the one hand that the Civil Rights Act, and he's been talking about it all evening, was an important piece of legislation, that the Congress did the right thing, though he acknowledges they had to be dragged kicking and screaming, many of them, to do it. What's interesting about that is he then says we have to rely on the good instincts of the majority, but by definition, if we had been able to rely on the good instincts of the majority, we would never have needed a Civil Rights Act. The debate is over. We would not have needed a Voting Rights Act. We would not have needed a Fair Housing Act. By definition, laws get passed because we don't trust that people will do the right thing. That's why we have laws against murder, because folks kill. That's why we have laws against theft, because people steal. The reason we pass laws is because we don't leave it up to chance. And even he believes that. I quoted him from 1994, and he did not take the chance to repudiate his former position, so I assume he still holds to it. And that position was, and you heard it before, that as long as there's rampant discrimination, affirmative action did have a purpose. He wants to say it's about principle. He wants to say it's about a principled opposition to treating people differently, but even he has said and is on record as saying in front of the California State Assembly that different standards, in fact, and different treatment can be done and should be done when there is evidence of profound discrimination. So then when he says stats don't matter, he's being intellectually disingenuous, because he's saying that in the past, when it was going down badly, even by his admission for folk of color, that affirmative action was fine. Like I told you, the only issue now is whether or not things have fundamentally changed. He would like you to believe it has. He has presented not one iota of information to suggest that it has. The only person who has presented any evidence at all, which I thought mattered in the context of an academic debate at a college where history and statistics and facts are sort of the point, has been me. Doesn't mean that I'm right, but it does mean that the standards for intellectual discourse are being set on one and not the other side. He says that Dr. King relied on the majority, but of course he didn't, because the majority didn't support him, and he knew it. In fact, he was very clear in both the letter from the Birmingham jail and in later writings that he believed the majority of white folks were not on board the fight for racial equity, but it didn't stop him. And since we brought up Dr. King, I think it is incumbent upon me to say, as a preemption to what I fear may come in the closing statement. He's been very good about not saying it yet, because he said it several years ago, sort of got his hand slapped for it. So, Ward Connerly used to go around saying Dr. King would have been opposed to these policies because he believed we should be treated on the content of our character and not the color of our skin and all of that. It's always funny how folks, I'm not talking about Mr. Connerly, he's considerably deeper than that, but a lot of folks will say that as if they only heard one line from one speech that Dr. King ever gave. This man was a preacher. He spoke at least every Sunday. But some folks have only heard this one line out of context. Because see, the very same year that Dr. King gave that talk in Washington, he also wrote a book called Why We Can't Wait. In fact, he'd finished the book before the march. And in that book, he said, and he was very unambiguous about it, he said, whenever this issue of preferential or compensatory treatment is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they insist, but should ask for nothing more. While at first this seems reasonable, in fact, it is unrealistic, for it is obvious that if you take a man and put him at the starting line of a race 300 years after another man, the first man would have to perform some incredible feat in order to catch up. Now, it doesn't mean that Dr. King was right, or that I, because I support his view, am right, and that Ward Connerly is wrong. Just because King said it doesn't make it gospel, but it does mean that we have to look at history honestly and not hijack the movement in the name of so-called fairness, when the movement and its principal leader, or one of them, was very clear about what justice did and did not demand. It isn't about disdaining the majority. It is about realizing that the majority can't, in fact, be trusted to always do the right thing vis-a-vis minorities numerically or in terms of power. That's why we have a Bill of Rights. That's why we have a Constitution. That's why we had to have an abolition movement and a civil rights movement and all the laws that both Mr. Connerly and I support. It isn't about disrespecting the majority. It is about realizing that even the best intended people oftentimes do not do what is needed to uproot structures of injustice. Thank you very much.
Coming out of Jim Crow, yes, affirmative action made sense. But things are profoundly different today. Things are profoundly different today. James Meredith was the only one who could go to the University of Mississippi. Doors were locked tight against black people. You cannot, with a straight face, say that circumstances are the same today. Affirmative action was different then. It was designed to make sure that there was no discrimination against people because of their race or their skin color. That made sense. So the next time you go someplace, you can quote that I said here tonight. That made sense. But circumstances have changed profoundly during those years. We are on the threshold of a totally new paradigm with regard to race. The court is going to make a change. If we want to provide access to people who are now locked out, we're going to have to find other means of doing it. Mr. Wise can argue until the cows come home about what he says that I said 20 years ago or 10 years ago. But if we stand around still arguing this notion of race-based affirmative action, we're not serving the people of this country very well. We have to find new ways of helping those who are trapped in the inner city, who are trapped in rural areas, who are locked out of college opportunities, regardless of their race, regardless of their skin color. Race-neutral ways will have to be fashioned. We need to eliminate legacies. There is no rationale for a public agency giving the ancestors of someone a preference, regardless of whether they're white or black. There is every rationale for us to design an affirmative action program that helps people who are low income, who've never had parents go to college, who go to schools that do not provide the same opportunities as other schools, to equalize those schools, to equalize the opportunities. It doesn't make any sense for us to be slinging arrows at each other on the basis of what I said and what he said. The solution, it seems to me, is for us to recognize that times are changing. There is about to be an end to race-based affirmative action. By popular will, at the ballot box, and by the courts. What are we to do? Find an alternative. One that the majority of people can embrace. They will embrace socioeconomic. So I would urge us to do that. Thank you.
now have our closing statements. I would ask the audience to start preparing your questions. We'll have a 25 or 30-minute question and answer session after the close of the closing statements. Mr. Wise, your closing statement.
Mr. Connerly would suggest to you that it is somehow a principled position to dismantle policies which treat people different on the basis of race. And in theory, that may be a perfectly legitimate position. But if people have been treated differently on the basis of race for centuries, and that treatment continues today, albeit not in exactly the same fashion as under Jim Crow, which of course I never suggested, and if that different treatment has had an effect, a profound one, on the distribution of opportunities and resources, and it has, and the only evidence today suggests that it has, then to not seek remedies that target opportunities specifically to those who indeed have been injured and continue to be injured on the basis of race, irrespective of class, though class is also an issue, is to ensure the perpetuation of that entrenched racial inequality. If it's not going to be affirmative action, and he may well be right about what the court is inclined to do, thanks to his efforts and the efforts of others on his side of the aisle, he may indeed get his wishes. If not affirmative action, then his responsibility is to suggest what can replace it that can close the racial gaps, because it is the racial gap that has been created by the history about which we've spoken. And socioeconomic affirmative action, though a very good idea, cannot by definition close the racial gap, because the racial gap is both perpetuated and instrumentalized on the basis of racial discrimination, both past and present, not merely economic. For example, most of the people who say they support economic affirmative action, Dick Kallenberg and others that have written books about it, who are not necessarily wrong. The problem is their interpretation of economic status is so limited that it would in fact guarantee that thousands of people of color who were not poor but who indeed faced obstacles would be overlooked, because it usually amounts to looking at your income, the occupational status of your parents, and the educational status of your parents. But the problem with that is that we do have a lot of Black and Latino families in the country making good incomes. Income disparity has diminished. That's a good thing that has happened in the last 30 and 40 years. But the wealth disparities, the disparities in assets, and assets are key to financing college educations. We know that really it isn't your income that you use to pay for your kids to go to school. It's the equity in your house. It's the savings that you have. And remember what I said at the outset, the average white family, 11 to 12 times the net worth, the assets minus debts of the average Black family, 8 to 10 times the average for Latinos, which means that if we're going to use an economic standard, either as an addition to race or as a supplement, let me caution you, do not fall into the trap of only looking at income, because that will then essentially look at Black folks who make good money, have good jobs, and say, well, you don't face any real obstacles anymore. Not realizing that relative to white families who indeed have a huge head start in terms of assets, wealth, and net worth, that in fact that disparity is still quite profound. So if we're going to do what Mr. Connerly says, either as a supplement, which I would support, or as an alternative, which he would support, we got to be very careful, because socioeconomic status isn't just about your paycheck, and it isn't just about the kind of job that you have. It is about assets. If we want to have an asset test, try to get that pushed through at most schools. Try to get families, white, Black, or otherwise, to really want to come clean about all the stuff they own. Good luck. It's going to be very difficult to do, to actually track down what folks' assets are. So it's not that it's a bad idea. It's just that it doesn't take into consideration the profound inequalities that go beyond what we typically think of as socioeconomic status. Look, at the end of the day, it's very simple. We're here to debate a principle: is affirmative action good for America? Whether or not affirmative action is going to be eliminated, that's a debate about principle. I have suggested to you that indeed affirmative action is good for one very simple and overriding reason. It is, although an imperfect mechanism, and I don't know a single person who supports it that thinks it is a perfect or complete mechanism. Certainly I do not. But it is the only one articulated up into this point that can begin to diminish the institutionalized white racial preferences that have been entrenched in this country for hundreds of years, unless you have a very clear example of what the other side would do to eliminate entrenched white racial preference, which is the default position of our society. Then the answer to the question put before us tonight, irrespective of what the court may or may not do, is yes, that affirmative action is good for America because it is good for the creation of equality. Thank you very much for coming out.
He's right about one thing. This is about principle. He's absolutely right about that. And there's one principle that's unassailable, and that is, should the government treat its citizens differently on the basis of race? The answer is no. No. The government has a duty to treat you and I as equals. It had that duty in the 1960s. Before then, it didn't always do it. People like me didn't always treat us equally. And I don't have to go through all the things that the government did that were wrong to my ancestors. But I know one thing, it doesn't have to do it to me, and I should not countenance it doing it to anybody else. That's the lesson that we should have learned from it. Civil rights are for everybody. Black, white, purple, green, you name it. Civil rights belong to everybody. And if this is about an ideal, if this is about a principle, as Mr. Wise so eloquently says, then let's live out the meaning of that ideal. And that is that every American citizen is entitled to the equal treatment before the law. You can't fudge that. You just can't fudge it. We can argue, and we should argue, about a lot of things. But there's one thing we should not argue about, and that's our right to be treated equally by our government. We can't opt out of it. April 15th, they're going to come looking for us if we don't send in that envelope with some money in it. We don't have any choice about whether we belong to the government or not. Therefore, it has a duty to treat all of us as equals. And if we see discrimination, we ought to say, it's wrong, and insist that it be changed, regardless of people's skin color, regardless of their race, whatever that means, regardless of their religion, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of any of that.